We call this the People's Powerhouse because at its core, this very modest project is a story about resisting a kind of singular tourist icon and instead creating a variety of settings for the broadest possible range of users. And that's important to us as a practice because we exist to enrich public life. So the idea of from an icon to stages. We are here on the Mighty Murray, 7 hours from Melbourne on the country of the first people of the Millewa Mallee. And this distance is physical, so we specified local materials and suppliers where possible.
So where is it in Mildura?
I'm going to show you. It's on
Sorry.
But it's also very much a psychological distance. So Mildura has a sense of being very isolated and on its own. And the community were very clear that Melbourne architecture, whatever that in fact may be, was not appropriate and would be rejected. So this is where we are. I don't know if I can
Sorry.
do that. So we're on this fantastic bend in the Murray. The CBD is number 6, so very, very close to the site. But the CBD is on an escarpment, so a full kind of 1.5 story level change from the riverfront. So this project was very much about activating the riverfront, which is really crawling with cyclists and pedestrians in that early morning period before the sun heats up. After which there's really no kind of amenity or activity to keep people there and also no thermal comfort. It was about really reorienting the city back to its riverfront as well. And the powerhouse itself, so this is our powerhouse here from one of the historical images, was part of a broader settler industrial complex that irreparably changed the river wetlands, but it also brought electrification to Mildura. So the broader community, very generally speaking, has both a great pride in the innovation of their forebears, but also a real desire to centre Indigenous culture in this place. It's not a priority project for the first people of the Millewa Mallee. They see this site as culturally sterile, but they were very keen that the programming and the inclusiveness of the precinct was responsive. We inherited a master plan, so this one here on the left, that sets out the redevelopment for the whole riverfront area. So it's to become an entire new expansion of the CBD with multi-storey, medium density housing. And our precinct there in the middle is to be the key social and cultural and kind of commercial heart for the precinct. But on appointment, in the middle of the COVID lockdown, and I guess amplifying that sense of distance from the urban elite, there was a real reaction from the community to what they perceived as overdevelopment of the riverfront. So despite the funding having come from all tiers of government for tourism, there was a real shift in emphasis of the project, and this had to benefit local businesses, local social enterprises. And so what that meant for us was that we had to have a lot less built form. We had to make sure that more of the site was allocated to landscape, but we also had to make sure that it was activated. We had to make sure that we had much smaller, far more flexible facilities offered that could be offered at low cost to local groups, but we couldn't hand council a financial burden. This is rural city council. So we were supposed to be ripping on with design, but our project had a bit of an identity crisis, and together with council we really broadened our net in terms of understanding who all of the possible users of this place could be, rather than the pitch that had talked about an art gallery, for example. And our brave client really endorsed a much more kind of lo-fi DIY approach to this precinct. So we went from this singular spectacular object to kind of shifting territories for individual tribes, but also for all of those tribes to come together. So the people own the powerhouse, they program the powerhouse primarily, and the idea is that tourists will come to see people in the powerhouse. It's really about a human-centred approach. Our brief became essentially the most for the least. This is an incredibly tight budget project, and something of this place, distinctly Milduran and Riverside. So our design language really, at all scales, centred around 3 kind of big ideas. The first being a shift from an industrial to a kind of sensorial approach. So the powerhouse itself has a scale, a presence, and of course the thermal performance of an industrial building. An early move was to reinstate the ghost of the boiler house, the powerhouse's early companion in the precinct. And these 2 vast roofs then gave us one of the first opportunities to turn an extractive complex into the beginning of a restorative one, so solar arrays and batteries, which is a nice circle of life for a powerhouse. So that boiler house space provides really deep shade in the extreme heat, and it also functions as a whole bunch of outdoor kind of performance spaces. Around these two mammoth structures, we slung a series of kind of almost follies. These are the first public hemp masonry buildings in Australia, so the result of several years of R&D by our practice, and again, a brave client that was prepared to lead the charge there. And, sorry, this is what hemp looks like being formed up on site. So this shift from the kind of industrial object to something that was much kind of richer and diverse as a sensory experience to help you navigate through this landscape, which will continue to shift over time. Really, primarily for us, it was about this expression of mass, skeleton and skin. So the powerhouse itself really anchors the precinct with its vast mass. The boiler house building is reinterpreted as a kind of skeleton with rusted skin. And then we play with luminosity and transparency across the other buildings, which is really around passive surveillance, nighttime lighting, sept-edge, all that kind of stuff. And both externally and internally on a really lean budget with a whole bunch of complexities during construction. You will remember that the Murray flooded pretty substantially. We have prioritised textures and materials that have a nod to the industrial past, but are really rewarding to the senses through that tactility and a kind of density of tactility. There was a real attempt to stay away from any kind of institutionalised Melbourne architecture. The next big idea was this shift from a kind of formal to informal language. So once we had reinstated the boiler house building, we were fast approaching the village green that the master plan had set out. That term, so the Eurocentricity of that term, but also its spatial typology, was really clearly rejected from first consultation with traditional owners, broader Aboriginal community and the wider community. So there was this real emphasis on kind of fluidity and intimacy, I guess, and really bringing the industrial scale down to something that was much more tactile. What we tried to do was really use the least amount of built form possible, going back to this community, real resistance to overdevelopment. This is essentially the fourth concept design we did for the project. So it was really about how little can we build to make sure that we create this sense of zones and place. So we leant on landscape, still immature in these photos, but landscape and the shifting ground, which does move substantially across our site and the surrounding areas. And this is both political, but it's also profoundly pragmatic. So we are essentially a catalyst for reactivating the riverfront, and there's going to be vast development that happens around our site. It's master planned, but of course we don't quite know how it will unfold. So this precinct really needs to be able to jostle with the community demand and with future changes to the precinct. Internally too, there's a fluidity and a visual porosity. This is the powerhouse shown in kind of shut down mode, which means that the council can program each of the discrete spaces, but the glazed walls are operable. There's many lines of curtains to make sure that they can function in kind of festival or event mode as well. The last, kind of significant idea really is this response to the need to be read from above grade, at grade, from below grade, in fact, from down at the river. And you can just catch a glimpse of the bridge to New South Wales here. So, this kind of distance as well for tourists coming into town with the caravan. And so the design response was it's essentially a series of roofscapes, but we talked to the community about this idea of hats, which makes, a lot of sense in this climate. So the boiler house itself is kind of vast and scaly. It wears the rusted roof sheeting from the powerhouse building. The toilet building that you can see here as you descend from the CBD wears a little cap, so it has a kind of openness around it that marks one of many entries into the site. The cafe, again with a kind of playful nod to the industrial past, wears this really kind of compressed sawtooth roof, but it has this luminosity to its skin, so it can be illuminated all of the colours of the rainbow, and acts as a kind of beacon signifying, to tourists and locals alike that something is happening here at this place. And what is happening here, we think, and Council's placemaker, who they bravely put on to run the precinct, I think would agree, is that this is really about the community kind of seeing itself and each other and renewing its sense of self through these encounters in this place, rather than kind of consuming what the original pitch to government had set out. At the opening ceremony, the Mayor declared that Mildura finally had its own Fed Square. So with apologies to Don and Lad, we kind of feel that that's proof that this is in fact the people's powerhouse. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.